The late winter sky over Pine Hollow hung low and heavy, a quilt of gray stitched with slow-moving clouds. James Carter eased his patrol car to the curb and cut the engine. For a beat, the only sound was the brittle tick of cooling metal and the hush of wind through the pines. Wood smoke threaded the air. Someone on Maple Street had a fire going, and it folded into his chest with the kind of comfort you can't bottle. He pictured
Dispatch,
Emily's
this is Officer
braid
Carter
a little
at Pine
crooked,
Hollow. We have a situation.
cartoons murmuring in the background. Ranger's tail thudding against the wall like a metronome of welcome. He'd told the shift sergeant he needed to be home. Surprise his kid after a week chasing paperwork and winter wrecks. A small gift, an ordinary one, and that felt right. He grabbed the overnight bag from the passenger seat. Hot chocolate packets tucked beside a new set of soft pencils Emily liked, and climbed the steps. The door gave under the key with the easy click of habit. He stepped into a hushed house that didn't fit the picture in his head. No animated voices from the TV. No clatter of colored pencils rolling off the coffee table. The heat was on, faint and steady, but the air felt thin, as if the rooms were holding their breath. Ranger padded out from the hallway, black and tan coat catching the slice of pale light from the window. No tail thump, no bounce. The dog's ears pricked, fixed, tracking some point above and beyond James. And his body went still the way a compass needle goes still when it finds true north. James felt a small elastic snap inside him, just enough to pull his attention taut. Years on the force had tuned him to this kind of silence. Not peaceful, suspended, wrong. "Em," he called. Voice kept light on purpose. It floated into the stairwell and dissolved. He set the bag down, left his boots by the mat, toes already cold on the hardwood. Ranger shifted first, a silent decision, and sprang for the stairs, nails skittering, then catching rhythm on the polished treads. James followed, two at a time, his palm finding the banister's familiar grooves, pulse stepping up to meet the dog's pace. He'd learned to trust Ranger's judgments the way he trusted a good partner's. You move, then you think, then you breathe again. At the top landing, the hallway stretched like a quiet throat. The door to Emily's room was ajar. The little felt banner she'd stitched, "Stars live here," tilted in the draft. Ranger slipped in. James crossed the threshold and time folded. Emily lay crumpled near the foot of her bed, a spill of light brown hair unfurling across the blue carpet. Her face was paler than any winter day had a right to make it. Ranger had already tucked close to her side, nose hovering near her mouth, drawing in information the way he'd been trained to do in the old days. James's training jolted awake too, trampling the father in him only enough to keep his hands from shaking. Kneel, check, count. He reached for her wrist, felt it, a flutter, not strong, not gone. He leaned nearer and saw the faint bluish tint at her lips, a detail so small it felt huge. The room, the house, the world, all of it tuned to the sound of his own breath and Ranger's steadying pant. "Hey, kiddo." He didn't push her shoulder, didn't jostle. He spoke like you speak to a wild bird in your open hands, hoping it will remember the sky. Ranger's eyes cut to him, amber and alert, as if to say, now. He stood, reached for the phone on her desk, and felt his thumb already dialing. The dispatcher's voice came crisp and calm. He matched it. Address, age, medical history. Words he'd given a dozen other fathers in a dozen other living rooms, now pressed back into his own life with startling clarity. In the silence between details, he could hear the soft hitch in Emily's breath. He told himself steady. He told himself present. He told himself, no one is gone. He told the dispatcher the thing that mattered most. She's breathing, It's shallow, but she's breathing. He kept his voice clipped, efficient, but he could feel the ache of an older memory tugging at the edges. The night he lost Beth, the way absence can roar. He didn't invite that memory in. Not now, not here. He set the phone down and slid back to the carpet. Ranger had angled his body so one flank formed a quiet barricade against Emily's small frame, a living shield that offered warmth without pressure. James kept talking, more for himself than for her. Small, ordinary things about hot chocolate, about how they'd try those pencils on a new starscape, about how the sky over Pine Hollow would be bright again after this storm of a day. The house answered with a tick from the baseboard heater, the faintest sigh at the window seam, the humming stillness of winter that makes every sound feel important. From downstairs, a delivery truck groaned past, chains snarling on its tires, and then the neighborhood went quiet again. He let his eyes move, scan, assess, anchor, finding every detail that proved the world was intact. The pale blue curtains she'd chosen, speckled with hand-drawn constellations. The sketchbook on the chair, open to a dog's profile that looked a lot like Ranger. The small, brave mess of crayons she never remembered to cap. He stored each marker of normalcy like a warm stone in his pocket. If he had to walk through a cold place, he wanted heat to hold. Ranger's breathing slowed, matched to Emily's. James watched the dog's chest rise and fall. The old K9 knew things before he did. He always had. He remembered the day Ranger joined their family after retirement from the search and rescue unit, a celebration with a paper crown Emily had made and stuck crookedly between the shepherd's ears. In every picture from that afternoon, Ranger looked mildly amused and deeply patient, a guardian who understood ceremony mattered to kids, that ritual builds courage. That memory steadied him now. From the street came the faintest lift of sound, distant sirens, still small enough to doubt. He pictured red in the gray sky and kept his mind here, this room, this child. He laid a hand an inch above Emily's shoulder, a father's blessing that didn't disturb. Ranger flicked an ear, like a relay caught and passed. James breathed again. The housekeeper's note still sat on the dresser, a neat square in Karen's precise hand. Grocery run, back by 5. He glanced at the clock. Not 5 yet. The week had been long for everyone. He imagined Karen setting a pot of soup to simmer and choosing, kindly, not to wake a resting child. He'd thank her later, he would. But for now there was only the hallway where boots would thud, the radio chatter that would break into the hush, the precise ballet of responders he knew by first name. Another breath from Emily, a fraction deeper. He counted it like a blessing. He let the murmur of gratitude move through him. Not for the crisis, that word felt too big and theatrical, but for the threads holding under strain. Ranger's alertness, the dispatcher's steady cadence, the muscle memory that kept a father from coming undone. The sirens were closer now. The world outside the window kept being itself, pines brushing the gray, somewhere a crow throwing its opinion at the day. And James promised silently, as if pledging it to the boards and beams, that whatever changed after this would change with gentleness. He heard tires on slush, doors, quick voices. He called out, "Upstairs!" And the house answered. Footsteps, a bag unzipped. The careful, practiced kindness of strangers who weren't strangers at all. He looked once more at Ranger. The shepherd didn't move, didn't blink, didn't ask for thanks. James gave it anyway, in the small nod of a man who knows what partnership means. Later, he'd search for the moment the afternoon tipped, the exact second a quiet house became a waiting room for help. But right now, all those seconds were beads on a single string. Hold steady. Hold close. Keep breathing. And beneath it all, the question he didn't yet have words for tightened like a knot. If the sky could look this ordinary while everything shifted, what else in their lives had been silently rearranging itself, waiting for him to notice? Dim afternoon light slanted through the pale blue curtains, soft enough to make the dust motes seem frozen in midair. The room felt smaller now, the air thick, holding each sound as if reluctant to let it go. James dropped to his knees beside Emily, the wood of the floor biting into his kneecaps. He leaned close. There it was, the faint rise of her chest. Breathing. Shallow, but still there, a thin strand of relief threaded through the thudding in his ears. Emily. Hey. His voice came out low, steady in a way he wasn't sure he could sustain. His fingers found the inside of her wrist, weak pulse but present. He pressed the back of his hand against her cheek. Her skin was cool. He pulled his phone from his belt and punched the emergency number without looking, his thumb already knowing the path. 911. What's your emergency? This is Officer James Carter, Pine Hollow PD, he said. Each word clipped, every syllable exact. 10-year-old female, unresponsive but breathing. Possible seizure. Need EMS at 47 Maple Street, now. The dispatcher's questions came quick, and his answers were even quicker. Age, medical history, the time he'd found her, her breathing pattern. He glanced at Ranger, who had curled his body against Emily's side, head resting just close enough to feel her breath. The shepherd's eyes stayed on James, unwavering, like he was demanding, "Don't waste a second." "I'm here, kiddo," James murmured between the dispatcher's prompts. "I'm right here." The front door opened downstairs. The sound was soft, but cut through the moment like a crack in glass. "Hello?" Karen's voice carried up the stairs. "Up here!" James called, not raising his tone too much. He didn't want to jolt Emily. Karen's footsteps were quick. She appeared in the doorway, grocery bag still in her arms, cheeks flushed from the cold. Her eyes widened at the sight on the floor. "Oh my God, she's breathing," James cut in, calm but firm. "Shallow. Call the door for the medics. Make sure it's unlocked. They're on the way." Karen set the bag down, apples rolling inside, and hurried back toward the stairs. "I thought she was napping," she said over her shoulder, voice trembling. James didn't answer, not out of blame. There was no room for that here, but because his focus couldn't stretch beyond this small patch of carpet where everything that mattered existed. Sirens began as a faint echo, distant enough that they could almost be mistaken for wind in the pines. But they grew, tightening in pitch, until James could feel them more than hear them. He brushed a loose strand of hair from Emily's face. "Help's here," he told her, even though her eyes were closed. "You hang on for me." Ranger shifted his weight, but didn't move from his post. His breathing was slow even, the way it always was when he was trying to calm someone else. Boots hit the porch. Radio chatter flickered through the open door. Karen's voice guided them in. 2 paramedics swept into the room, their bags thumping against their legs. "What have we got?" the taller one asked, dropping to the opposite side of Emily. "Seizure history. Found her like this. Breathing's shallow, pulse weak but steady," James replied, already shifting back to give them space. They worked quickly. Oxygen mask, vitals, gentle but practiced movements as they lifted her onto the stretcher. Ranger rose when James did, shadowing each step. "I'm riding with her," James said, his tone making it clear it wasn't a question. The lead medic nodded. "Dog's fine to come if he stays clear." They maneuvered down the stairs, the stretcher steady in their grip. The cold air hit as soon as the front door opened, the kind that snaps you awake. Inside the ambulance, James took the seat beside the stretcher. His left hand closed over Emily's limp one. His right held Ranger's collar, not to restrain, but to anchor himself. The shepherd stood pressed against his knee, eyes locked on Emily. The engine rumbled, siren wailing as they pulled away from Maple Street. James kept his gaze on her face, searching for any flicker, any sign of her coming back to him. And all the while a single thought ran beneath everything else, quiet but relentless. Not again. Not her. The fluorescent lights in Pine Hollow Medical Center's emergency wing hummed softly, their white glare bouncing off tile floors that smelled faintly of antiseptic. James sat in the plastic chair beside Emily's bed, his knees angled toward her, elbows resting on them, fingers laced so tightly they ached. Monitors beeped in slow, steady intervals, and each sound felt like it was measuring the pace of his own heartbeat. Emily lay still, her light brown hair fanned across the pillow, oxygen tubing curling over her cheeks. Ranger sat on the floor at the foot of the bed, front paws crossed, amber eyes fixed on her the way they might fix on a missing person in the woods, never leaving, never wavering. A nurse with a calm, deliberate stride checked Emily's vitals and adjusted a drip line. "Her oxygen saturation is stable," she said, glancing at James. "The doctor will be in soon to go over everything." Stable. The word eased some of the tightness in his chest, but only a fraction. He tried to count how many times he'd been in this room. Not literally this room, but rooms just like it. Once after the car accident that took Beth. Twice for Emily's seizures when she was younger. Each time the air had this same weight, as if the building itself was holding its breath along with him. The door swung open. Dr. Priya Desai stepped in, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes warm but sharp. James had worked with her before on community calls. He trusted her competence, but tonight her presence made his shoulders stiffen. He was braced for impact. "She had a tonic-clonic seizure," Dr. Desai began, scanning the chart. "It lasted longer than most of her previous episodes. We've run blood work and a neuro exam. The good news is she's recovering well physically from the episode, but..." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "After 10 months without any seizure activity, this is a setback. We'll need to adjust her medication and schedule another EEG." James felt the words land like stones. Setback. After almost a year, he'd let himself believe they'd outrun this thing. He'd let himself relax. Maybe too much. "What triggered it?" he asked, his voice steady but low. "It's hard to say," Dr. Desai replied. "It could be growth changes, stress, even subtle changes in her sleep cycle. Sometimes, unfortunately, we don't get a clear answer." Her tone was measured, but James heard the unsaid part. Control was an illusion. Relief that Emily was alive tangled with guilt so sharp it almost made him wince. He thought back to the last few weeks. Her saying she was tired, him brushing it off with a "get some rest, kiddo," instead of looking deeper. He'd been chasing deadlines, patrol calls, small-town politics, telling himself she was fine because that was easier to carry. Ranger shifted, laying his head on his paws. His slow breathing filled the quiet between heart monitor beeps. Dr. Desai outlined the next steps: medication changes, follow-up appointments, a closer watch for early warning signs. James nodded at the right times, but part of him was somewhere else, replaying every moment he might have missed something, every chance he'd had to notice more. When she finished, Dr. Desai's voice softened. "She's resilient, and you're not alone in this, James." He gave a small nod, unable to meet her eyes for long. After she left, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Emily's face. Her eyelids fluttered just enough to show the faintest awareness, but she didn't wake. He rested his hand on the blanket near her fingers, close enough for contact if she reached out in her sleep. Ranger sat up again, eyes locking with his. James knew that look. It was the same one the shepherd had given him earlier at home, the one that said, "You act now, or you lose ground." He exhaled slowly, the antiseptic air sharp in his lungs. The stability he'd built his life around, his routines, his watchfulness, his belief that his presence alone could keep Emily safe, had been cracked open in one afternoon. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried, and the sound pulled him back to the present. He checked his watch, not because time mattered here, but because it was a habit he couldn't break. Emily's hand twitched beneath the blanket, and instinctively he reached to cover it with his own. "I'm here," he murmured, unsure if she could hear him. Her breathing was slow, steady now, matched in rhythm by Ranger's. James knew this night would etch itself into the timeline of their lives. Not for the fear alone, but for the reminder it carried. Whatever control he thought he had was temporary, and the real work ahead wasn't about chasing that control. It was about learning how to stand steady in the uncertainty, for both of them. Snow was falling by the time James let himself back into the house that evening. The porch light pooled gold over the front steps, catching flakes in its glow. Each step he took sounded muffled under the powder that had started to gather on the boards. The air inside was warmer than he expected, still carrying the faint trace of Karen's soup from earlier, but it didn't ease the heaviness in his chest. Emily was resting in the hospital for the night under observation. Ranger had insisted on following him home. At least that's how it felt when the shepherd stood by the car door until James opened it. Now the dog padded in ahead of him, giving the rooms a slow scan before disappearing toward the stairs. James shrugged off his jacket, set the grocery bags Karen had packed for him on the counter, and headed to Emily's room. The curtains were drawn tight, muting the falling snow to a whisper against the glass. The bed was neatly made, blankets smoothed and tucked. Her sketchbook was closed on the pillow, pencils lined up beside it, an uncharacteristic orderliness that told him Karen had tidied up. He pulled her backpack from under the desk and began collecting things for her stay. Soft pajamas, her favorite hoodie, the blue knit socks she wore on cold hospital nights. Ranger reappeared and sat squarely in the middle of the room, watching him pack. Then the dog's gaze shifted to the corner desk. He moved toward it, sniffing at the lower drawers. "What is it?" James asked, not really expecting an answer, but following the line of interest. Ranger pawed at the bottom drawer, once, twice, then stepped back and looked up at James. It was stuck. James knelt, pulled at the handle, and felt it resist. He braced a knee against the side and tugged harder until the wood gave with a reluctant groan. Inside was a neat stack of envelopes, each one folded and addressed in careful, looping handwriting. Mom. The sight knocked the air out of him. He sat back on his heels, the envelopes resting in his palm like fragile artifacts. The first letter he opened was written in Emily's rounded script. "Hi, Mom. I had another dizzy day, but I didn't tell Dad because he worries too much. Ranger stayed with me, though. I think he knows before I do when it's coming. I don't want Dad to look sad, so I just say I'm tired. I'm trying to be strong, like he says." James read the words twice, maybe 3 times, before lowering the page. The room seemed smaller, the air sharper. He opened another. "I wish you were here so I could tell you things without making anyone worry. I keep them in my head until I can write to you instead." His throat tightened, a pressure rising from somewhere deep and unguarded. He had told her to be strong, again and again, in moments when he didn't have space to show his own fear. But somewhere in translation, those words had turned into a rule. "Don't speak about the hard parts." Ranger lay down beside him, chin resting on his paw, eyes tracking James's every move. It was as if the dog had known this drawer needed to be opened, that its contents were another kind of emergency. James set the letters back carefully, not ready to read them all, but unwilling to hide them again. His hand rested on the edge of the open drawer as his mind replayed the last year. The missed cues, the moments when Emily had chosen silence over risking his sadness. He'd thought his presence was enough, that his steady voice and sure hands built safety. But these letters, showed him the gaps. Snow tapped softly at the window. The heater clicked on, filling the room with a faint hum. James stayed crouched on the floor, Ranger's steady breathing beside him. He reached down, scratching lightly behind the shepherd's ear. "Good work, partner," he murmured. He rose slowly, packing the last of Emily's things into the bag. The letters stayed in the drawer for now. He would bring them to her when the timing was right. He wanted her to see that he wasn't angry, only awake now to what she'd been carrying. Before leaving the room, he stood for a moment at the doorway, eyes tracing over the sketches pinned above her desk. Stars, trees, and one of Ranger, drawn in a way that made the dog look bigger than life. Maybe in her world, he was. The snow outside was falling heavier now, the kind that muffled the whole town. But James felt a sharper clarity inside. The drawer had been stuck, but now it was open, and nothing he'd seen could be unseen. The hospital room was dim except for the glow from the bedside lamp. The muted hum of machines blended with the occasional distant footsteps in the hallway. James sat in the chair beside Emily's bed, elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. Ranger was curled on the floor, his head close to the edge of the mattress so that one warm breath from Emily could ruffle the fur on his muzzle. She stirred slightly, her hand twitching under the blanket. Ranger's ears flicked up before James even moved. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she blinked against the low light, her gaze slowly finding his face. "Dad." Her voice was hoarse, like it had been tucked away for too long. "I'm here," he said, leaning forward. "Been here all night." Ranger rose, nudged his nose under her palm, and she let her fingers curl against his fur. It was the first sign of real ease he'd seen on her face since yesterday. For a moment, neither of them spoke. James could hear the faint tick of the clock above the door, the low exhale from Ranger, the sound of his own pulse in his ears. I read the letters," he said finally. His voice was steady but low, each word placed with care. Emily's hand froze on Ranger's head. She turned her face away, eyes fixed on the far wall. "You weren't supposed to." "I know," he said. "Ranger found them, or maybe he just knew I needed to." Her shoulders tensed under the blanket. "I didn't want you to think I was weak." He leaned closer, catching her gaze again even though she resisted. "Emily, you're not weak. Not for feeling scared. Not for having bad days. And not for telling me about them." She blinked quickly, as if trying to keep her eyes from giving her away. "But you always say to be strong." He sat back for a moment, letting the truth of that sink in. "I did. And I thought I meant it in a way that would help. But I realize now, I made it sound like there wasn't room for anything else. like you had to keep all the hard stuff inside. That's on me. Her lower lip trembled, and she bit it to still it. When I feel bad, I tell Ranger instead. He just listens. He doesn't get that look on his face like you do when you're worried. James felt the words settle deep, sharper than anything a doctor had told him. It wasn't an accusation. It was a truth. He had thought his guarded expressions kept her calm. In reality, they had made her guard herself. "I'm glad you have Ranger," he said. "But I want you to know, you can tell me too. I can listen without making you feel like you have to protect me. That's my job." She glanced at him then, just a flicker, before looking back at Ranger. "I don't want to make you sad." He reached for her hand and covered it gently. "I'd rather be sad with you than let you be scared alone." For a while they just sat like that, her hand in his, Ranger's steady warmth at her side. The air in the room felt lighter somehow, as if something long sealed off had finally cracked open. "You won't be mad if I tell you when I'm not feeling good?" she asked. "I'll be proud," he said, "because it takes strength to say it out loud." Her eyes softened, and she let out a slow breath. "Okay." He gave her hand a squeeze, the kind you give not just to reassure someone, but to anchor yourself to them. "From now on, no hiding. Not from me, not from each other." Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, the quiet punctuation to their new agreement. For the first time since the sirens yesterday, James felt the ground under him steady. It wasn't because everything was fixed. It wasn't. It was because they'd stopped pretending that it was. Outside the window, the snow had stopped falling. Streetlights glowed in the wet night, and the world felt just a little less cold. The next afternoon, pale winter sunlight spilled through the living room windows, pooling in warm rectangles on the hardwood floor. James stood in the doorway of what had once been his small home office. The desk was gone, the filing cabinet pushed to the garage. In its place, bright jars of paint and colored pencils lined a low shelf. A wide drafting table sat near the window, its surface empty and waiting. A beanbag chair slouched in the corner, and beside it, a thick, fleece-covered bed, just the right size for a certain German shepherd. He stepped back and looked around again, taking in the transformation. It had only taken 2 days of rearranging, borrowing tools from the station's storage and enlisting Karen's help. But the real change wasn't in the walls or the furniture. It was in the way the room felt, open, inviting, like it belonged to someone who was allowed to fill it with whatever was inside her head. Ranger padded in first, nails clicking on the floor, nose twitching as he inspected every corner. He sniffed the bed, then circled it twice before settling into the fleece with a sigh. James smiled. "Guess you approve." A light shuffle sounded in the hallway. Emily appeared in the doorway, still a little pale but steadier on her feet. Her braid was loose, wisps escaping to frame her face. She stopped short when she saw the room. "What is this?" Her voice was soft, wary in the way someone's voice gets when they're afraid to hope too much. "It's yours," James said. "A space to draw, paint, read, whatever you want. Ranger's bed is here, so you've got company anytime you're in here. Thought maybe you both could use a place that's just yours." She stepped inside slowly, her fingertips grazing the jars of colored pencils. "You moved your office?" "Yeah," he said, leaning on the doorframe. "Turns out paperwork works just fine in the kitchen. This room's better used for other things." She crouched by the drafting table, running her hands along its edge. "It smells like new wood." "It is," he said. "Had the hardware store cut it to size. The guy at the counter asked if it was for a school project. Told him it was for the most important project I've ever had. Emily looked up at him, her eyes catching the sunlight. There was no need for her to ask what he meant. Ranger shifted on his bed, his tail making a lazy sweep. Emily crossed to him, sank down beside the fleece and buried her fingers in his fur. "You like it too?" she asked him. The shepherd answered with a slow blink and a contented exhale. James stayed quiet, just watching. This was the first time since the hospital that Emily looked fully at ease. Not because she'd forgotten what happened, but because she was grounded here now, in something that was hers. "You don't have to use it for anything big," he said. "You don't even have to use it every day. But whenever you feel like you need somewhere to go, this is it." Emily leaned back against Ranger's side. "It feels safe." "That's the idea." She smiled then, a small one, but real. "Thanks, Dad." It wasn't just gratitude in her voice. It was something warmer, something that made the space between them feel shorter. James crossed to the window and pulled the curtain aside, letting in more light. Outside, the snow had melted into wet patches on the grass, the pines dripping with it. The day felt different than the last few, a little more forgiving. When he turned back, Emily was already opening her sketchbook on the drafting table. Ranger stayed in his bed, but kept his eyes on her, his ears swiveling with each scratch of pencil on paper. James didn't interrupt. He stepped out quietly, letting her have the room without the weight of him hovering. From the hallway, he glanced back once more. Emily was bent over the page, Ranger close enough to nudge her ankle if he wanted to. Sunlight poured over both of them, and for the first time in weeks, James felt like maybe they weren't just reacting to the storms anymore. Maybe they were building something stronger than shelter, something that could stand on its own, even in the dark. The house was wrapped in a deep, easy silence that only came after midnight. Outside, the snowmelt had turned to ice, and the branches of the pines glistened under a thin wash of moonlight. Inside, the baseboard heaters hummed, steady and low, and James slept on his side, one arm under the pillow, the other draped toward the edge of the bed. It started with a sound so small it might have been part of a dream, a single sharp bark from downstairs, then another, closer. Ranger's voice wasn't loud, but it carried that urgent, precise edge James knew too well from his years on patrol. He was out of bed before his mind had fully caught up, bare feet hitting the cold floor. Ranger's claws clicked on the hallway hardwood ahead of him, leading toward Emily's room. When James stepped inside, the air felt different, thicker somehow, like the room itself was holding its breath. Emily lay curled in bed, her head turned toward the wall, the blanket tangled around her legs. She was murmuring softly, words he couldn't make out, and her fingers twitched against the sheet. Ranger was already beside her, pressing the length of his body against hers, his weight deliberate but gentle. The shepherd's head rested just under her chin, one ear turned toward James, the other locked on her breathing. "Emily." James knelt on the other side of the bed, brushing her hair back. Her eyes were closed, lashes fluttering against her skin. Her murmurs broke into small, uneven gasps. He recognized the signs, too many times, in too many hospital rooms. This wasn't a full seizure, not yet, but it was close enough to pull every muscle in his body into readiness. "You're okay, kiddo," he murmured, keeping his voice low and even. "Ranger's here. I'm here." Ranger shifted slightly, applying more of his body weight along her side. James had read once about deep pressure therapy, how it could calm the nervous system. But Ranger didn't read articles. He just knew. He'd always known. After a minute, Emily's breathing began to steady, the tension in her hands loosening. The murmurs faded into quiet. Ranger didn't move until her shoulders dropped back into the rhythm of sleep. James stayed crouched beside the bed, his hand resting lightly on her blanket-covered arm. His heartbeat was still running too fast, but the edge of fear was giving way to something else, gratitude so sharp it almost hurt. He met Ranger's eyes in the dim light. "Good work," he said softly. The shepherd's tail gave one slow sweep across the mattress, but he didn't leave his post. James waited another few minutes before easing back to his feet. He didn't want to wake her. She needed the rest. He pulled the blanket back over her legs, making sure it was loose enough not to tangle her again. When he stepped into the hallway, Ranger followed, silent as a shadow. In the living room, James sank onto the couch, running a hand over his face. Ranger jumped up beside him, not something he usually did without invitation, and leaned his head into James's shoulder. "Guess I'm not the only one who can't go back to sleep right now," James murmured. The room was still dim, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting a pale arc across the floor. James let his thoughts settle. If Ranger hadn't been there, if he'd been in too deep a sleep. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat with the warmth of the dog pressed against him, and the quiet knowledge that this was more than companionship. It was a kind of vigilance no device could match. When he finally headed back upstairs, Ranger padded after him, settling in the hallway outside Emily's door. James knew the shepherd would stay there the rest of the night, ears tuned for the slightest change in her breathing. And for the first time in years, James let himself lean into the fact that he wasn't carrying this alone. The Pine Hollow Youth Art Showcase was always held in the town's historic library hall, a red brick building with arched windows that caught the afternoon light like stained glass. Inside, the air was a quiet mix of polished wood, faint paper dust, and the hushed rustle of people speaking in low tones as they moved between rows of easels. James held the door open for Emily and Ranger, letting them step in first. Emily wore a pale blue dress with sleeves that brushed her wrists, her hair braided loosely down her back. Ranger trotted at her side, the click of his nails muted by the worn rug beneath their feet. His ears pivoted in small, practiced arcs, scanning the crowd the way he used to sweep a search field. They made their way to her assigned spot, a simple wooden easel draped with a white cloth. The tags pinned to each display read only the artist's name until the unveiling began. Emily's name was printed neatly in block letters: Emily Carter, age 10. "You ready?" James asked, though his voice was more encouragement than question. She gave a small nod, but didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she rested her hand on Ranger's head, her fingers sinking into the thick fur behind his ears. The mayor gave a brief welcome, the kind of speech James had heard at every community event, about young talent, the importance of art in the town's culture, the pride they felt in their youth. Then, row by row, the cloths began to be lifted. Parents leaned in, phones raised, whispers of approval wove through the room. When it was Emily's turn, she stepped forward, and with both hands drew the cloth down from the top of her easel. The fabric slipped away, and the room seemed to still for a moment. Her piece, titled "My Guardian," was rendered in charcoal and watercolor. A German shepherd stood in the center of the frame, his body forming a barrier between a small girl and a violent, swirling storm. The storm was all motion, blurred strokes of gray and streaks of deep blue, while the dog was drawn in sharp, unwavering detail. His eyes locked forward, stance braced, every line of him declaring, "You will not pass." The girl in the painting was half hidden behind him, her hands buried in the fur at his chest. Her face was turned just enough to show the curve of her cheek, the shadow of her lashes, but not her full expression. Behind them, faint lightning forked in the distance, its light diffused by rain. James stared at it longer than he meant to, feeling his throat tighten. He didn't have to guess who the girl was, and he didn't have to guess who the dog was. But there was something else in the picture, something he hadn't expected. The clarity of Ranger's figure against the chaos made it clear that Emily had found her sense of safety not in him first, but in Ranger. It was humbling, a little painful even, but also strangely relieving. If he hadn't been there every moment, at least Ranger had. Beside him, a couple paused, whispering about the detail in the eyes, how alive the expression seemed. One of the judges leaned in to take a closer look at the texture of the fur, the subtle shading that made it feel tangible. James glanced at Emily. She was watching the people more than the painting, her shoulders drawn in slightly, as if she wasn't sure how they'd receive something so personal. When the judges returned with ribbons, my guardian was awarded first place in her age group. Applause filled the space, polite but warm. Emily smiled, small, fleeting, but enough for James to see pride break through her shyness. He knelt beside her and kept his voice low. "That's a brave piece, Em. You didn't just make something pretty. You told a truth. That's harder to do." Her eyes flicked toward him, uncertain. "It's about how I feel when Ranger's with me. Like the storm can't touch me." James nodded slowly. That's what good art does. It shows people the inside of something they can't see on their own. As they left the hall, the winter light had softened, turning the snowbanks outside into muted gold. Emily held Ranger's leash loosely, the shepherd walking close enough that his shoulder brushed her leg. James knew then that protection wasn't just about stopping harm. It was about creating a space where someone felt safe enough to open up, to create, to let themselves be seen. Ranger had been that constant for her, and instead of feeling replaced, James felt grateful. Because in the end, love wasn't about being the only shield. It was about making sure the shield was always there, even if it wasn't you. That night, the air outside carried the crispness that only came after a winter thaw, the kind that made each breath feel both sharp and clean. James spread an old quilt over the backyard grass, its faded plaid edges curling slightly from years of use. The ground was cool beneath it, still damp in spots where the snow had melted earlier that day. Above them, the sky was wide open, scattered with constellations that looked close enough to touch. Emily settled beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. Ranger lay between them, his body forming a bridge, one front paw resting lightly across Emily's ankle. His tail flicked lazily now and then, a quiet rhythm against the quilt. They sat like that for a while, letting the quiet of Pine Hollow at night wrap around them. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice before the sound dissolved into the hum of night insects. A faint breeze moved through the pines, rustling their needles with a soft sigh. Emily raised her hand and pointed toward the sky. "That's Orion's belt," she said, her voice low. "Mom used to read me a book about the constellations. I remember that one the most." James followed her finger, tracing the 3 bright stars in a neat row. "I remember," he murmured. They didn't talk about Beth much, Not because they'd forgotten, but because the memories came with edges. Tonight, though, the mention felt gentle, not like a wound being touched. "You know," he began, his voice softer than the wind, "you're never going to have to face anything alone again. Not seizures, not loneliness, not anything. Not as long as I'm around. And even when I can't be right next to you, I'm going to make sure you've got someone who is." Emily didn't answer right away. She reached down instead, scratching behind Ranger's ear. The shepherd turned his head slightly into her hand, his eyes closing in quiet contentment. "That's kind of what this feels like," she said finally. "Right now. Safe." James looked at her profile in the starlight, the curve of her cheek, the way her braid rested over her shoulder. "That's the point, kiddo. You get to feel that all the time, no matter what's going on." For years, he'd believed strength meant keeping his emotions locked tight, keeping everything under control so she could lean on him without seeing him falter. But somewhere between the hospital room, the letters in the drawer, and the painting in the library hall, he'd learned something else. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was let someone see your worry, your fear, and still stand with you in it. Emily shifted closer, the side of her head pressing more firmly against his arm. "You know what I like about looking at the stars?" "What's that?" "They've been there forever. No matter what happens down here, they're still up there. It makes the bad stuff feel smaller." He smiled faintly. "That's a pretty good way of putting it." Ranger gave a small huff, the kind he made when he was half asleep but still aware. James reached over, resting his hand on the dog's back. "You know," he said, "I think Ranger's got his own constellation, just invisible to the rest of us." Emily laughed quietly, the sound like a warm thread weaving through the cool night. They stayed outside longer than they planned, watching the stars inch across the dark. James let the silence between them be, knowing it wasn't empty. It was full of all the things they didn't have to say out loud. He thought about the storms they'd each carried, his grief, her illness, Ranger's tireless watchfulness, and he realized storms didn't always have to be fought alone. They could be shared, the weight divided, the noise softened. The night air grew cooler, but the quilt and the presence on either side of him kept the chill at bay. Above them, Orion stood steady in the sky, just as Emily had said, and for the first time in a long time, James felt like they weren't just surviving together. They were living under the same wide, open sky, and that was enough. The morning after their night under the stars, the first light of day stretched across Pine Hollow like a slow-moving tide. James sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in front of him, his phone propped up against the sugar jar. Outside the window, frost clung to the grass, turning it silver in the dawn. He scrolled through the photos on his phone, pictures he'd taken over the past few weeks. Emily and Ranger curled up on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder while she sketched. Ranger lying in the new art room, watching her fill a page with charcoal clouds. The painting from the library showcase captured under the hall's high windows. He wasn't much for posting online, but this morning felt different. He opened the video app, hesitated, then hit record. The camera caught him in the soft light, coffee steam curling between his words. "I've spent most of my life thinking I knew what a hero looked like," he began. "I wore a uniform, drove the car with the lights and sirens, carried the badge. And I thought, this is what protecting people means." He glanced off to the side, where Ranger was sprawled on the rug, tail thumping slowly, Emily's quiet humming drifting from the art room. But the truth is, heroes don't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes they pad in quietly on 4 legs, They don't carry badges, but they carry something stronger, this constant, unshakable presence. He paused, letting the words breathe. My daughter's been through storms I wish I could have stopped for her. And I'll admit, there were times I wasn't there in the way I should have been. But this guy, he gestured toward Ranger. He was, every time, without fail. The camera stayed on him, but his voice softened. I've learned something about protection. It's not just keeping someone safe from harm. It's about making sure they feel safe enough to speak, to rest, to be exactly who they are without fear. That's the kind of safety Ranger gives her. And that's the kind I'm trying to give her now. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under him. If you're listening to this, I'd ask you to take a look around your own life. Notice the quiet acts of love that happen every day. The ones that don't make noise but change everything. Maybe it's a friend who always answers the late-night call, a neighbor who shows up without being asked, or maybe it's an animal who just stays. James's eyes shifted toward the hallway, where Emily had appeared in the doorway, sketchbook in hand. She gave him a small, knowing smile before disappearing back into her room. He smiled back at the empty space she'd left, the moment caught only in memory. This isn't just a story about Emily and Ranger, he continued. It's a reminder that we all have guardians. Some we can see, some we can't. And maybe you've been one for someone else without even knowing it. He reached forward, ending the recording, but sat there a moment longer with his hands around the mug, feeling its warmth. Ranger got up from the rug and came to lean against his leg, as if to punctuate the moment. James bent down, resting a hand between the shepherd's ears. We've got a good thing going, partner, he said quietly. Let's keep it that way. Later that day, he posted the video. By evening, comments began to appear, people sharing their own stories of guardianship. A cat that slept on a boy's pillow through his cancer treatments. A teacher who noticed when a student stopped eating lunch. A brother who drove 3 hours to help fix a flat tire in the middle of the night. Each story was small in its telling, but enormous in its meaning. That night, James read a few aloud to Emily before bed. She listened with her head resting against Ranger's side, her eyes bright with the kind of recognition that only comes when you realize you're part of something bigger than yourself. And as James turned off the light, he thought about how this story, their story, wasn't really ending. It was just joining all the others, a quiet thread in a much larger fabric, because love in all its quiet forms doesn't fade when the moment passes. It lingers, it protects, and it invites others to do the same. And somewhere in Pine Hollow, under a sky filled with constellations, a father, a daughter, and a German shepherd kept watch together, each, in their own way, a guardian for the other.